The day my father came home from the war, the whole neighborhood stood outside to welcome him, flags waving softly in the afternoon air, neighbors smiling with relief, my mother gripping my hand so tightly it hurt, and everyone saying the same thing over and over again. "He's home now. Everything will be fine." But even as a young girl, I remember noticing something that no one else seemed ready to name, something quiet and unsettling, because my father did come home, yet the smile he carried back with him was not the same smile he had left with, and although his lips curved politely and his head nodded at familiar faces, his eyes stayed distant, like they were still fixed on something far away that none of us could see. I remember running toward him, my shoes scuffing the pavement, my heart racing with excitement, calling out "Daddy," expecting him to scoop me up the way he used to, spin me around, laugh loudly, and smell like soap and sunlight. But instead, he knelt down slowly, almost carefully, hugged me close for just a moment, and whispered my name as if he were afraid it might break. And that was the first time I felt the strange, confusing ache of realizing that someone can return physically while part of them stays behind. From that day on, our house was filled with quiet, a different kind of quiet than before, not peaceful, but careful, like everyone was walking on a thin layer of ice, afraid of making the wrong sound, because my father startled easily, flinched at loud noises, and stared out the window for long stretches of time, as if he were waiting for something he could not explain. My mother tried so hard to make things feel normal again, cooking his favorite meals, keeping the house spotless, smiling even when her eyes were tired, and telling me, "Give him time, sweetheart. He's just been through a lot." And I believed her because I wanted to, because loving someone means trusting that they will come back to you fully if you are patient enough. But time moved forward, seasons changed, birthdays passed, and while my father never raised his voice or showed anger, the warmth that once filled him never quite returned, and the man who used to laugh easily now smiled only in small, careful ways, like someone who had learned that joy could be dangerous if held too freely. I grew up watching him sit at the kitchen table late at night, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, staring into nothing. And even though I was just a child, I learned early how to read the silence, how to sense when not to ask questions, how to love someone who was present but unreachable. At school, other children talked about their fathers playing catch, fixing bikes, telling jokes, and while my father did those things when he could, there was always a heaviness in him, an invisible weight that followed him everywhere, and I began to understand that the war had not ended when he came home. It had simply changed its shape and moved inside him. Sometimes I would catch him smiling at old photographs, pictures taken before he left, when his face was open and unguarded, and for a brief second I would see the man my mother fell in love with, the father I remembered from my earliest years. But then the moment would pass, his expression closing like a door gently but firmly shut. As I grew older, I tried to be the perfect daughter, quiet, helpful, understanding, thinking that if I caused no trouble, if I asked for nothing, it might make things easier for him. But inside, I carried questions I never spoke out loud, wondering what he had seen, what he had lost, and why the war had taken something from him that never came back. Family gatherings were always polite and calm, never loud, never messy, and people often said how lucky we were that my father had returned safely, and I would nod along, smiling, even though a part of me felt guilty for thinking that safety did not always mean wholeness. There were moments, rare but precious, when he would place his hand on my shoulder, ask about my day, or tell me he was proud of me, and I treasured those moments quietly, holding on to them like small lights in a long hallway, because I learned that love does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides, and sometimes it survives in ways that are hard to explain. As the years went by, I watched my mother age faster than she should have, carrying not only her own worries, but his unspoken pain too. And I realized that war does not only affect the people who fight it, it reaches into homes, into marriages, into childhoods, shaping lives in ways that are not visible from the outside. Even now, when I think back to that day he came home, I remember the applause, the smiles, the relief in the air, and I understand why everyone believed the story had a happy ending. But what no one told us was that some endings are quiet, complicated, and unfinished, and that sometimes the hardest part is not waiting for someone to come back, but learning how to live with the version of them that does. As I grew older, I began to understand that my father's silence was not emptiness, but weight, a heaviness he carried with such discipline that it almost looked like calm, and yet it shaped every corner of our lives in ways that were subtle but lasting, like a shadow that moves with you no matter where you stand. He went to work every day, paid the bills on time, fixed what was broken around the house, and never complained. And from the outside, we looked like a family that had survived. But inside, there was a careful distance that none of us knew how to cross, because my father rarely spoke about the war, and when he did, his words were brief, factual, and stripped of emotion, as if feeling too much might pull him back to a place he was trying desperately to stay away from. I remember once asking him, very softly, what it had been like over there, and he paused for a long time before saying, "It was loud," and then he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me with a question that would echo through my life far longer than any answer could have. I learned to listen instead of asking, to notice the way his jaw tightened at fireworks, how he avoided crowded places, how he always sat facing the door in restaurants, and how his sleep was often broken by quiet restlessness, even though he never cried out or spoke in his dreams. My mother tried to fill the spaces he could not reach, giving me warmth, reassurance, and love in double portions, but I could see the loneliness in her, too, the way she missed the man who used to dance with her in the kitchen, who once laughed without hesitation, who held her like the world was safe, and I understood, even as a child, that she was grieving someone who was still alive. There were days when my father seemed almost normal, when his smile lingered a little longer or his voice sounded lighter, and those days gave me hope, made me believe that maybe one day he would come back fully, that whatever the war had taken from him might still be returned. But those moments were fragile, and I learned not to expect them, because disappointment became another quiet thing our family carried without naming. As I moved into my teenage years, I started to feel a mix of love and resentment that I didn't know how to handle, loving him deeply while also wishing he could be more present, more open, more willing to let us in. And that confusion stayed with me, shaping how I understood relationships, teaching me early that love and absence can exist side by side. I watched other fathers cheer loudly at school events, joke freely with their children, and show affection without restraint. And while I never doubted that my father loved me, I often wondered what it would have been like to grow up with the man he used to be, the one my mother described with such tenderness in her stories from before the war. Even as an adult, I carried his quietness with me, noticing how I too learned to keep emotions controlled, how I avoided conflict, how I believed that being strong meant being silent. And it wasn't until much later that I realized how deeply his unspoken pain had shaped the woman I became. The war ended long before I was old enough to understand it, but its echoes followed me through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, woven into my understanding of love, family, and resilience. And I came to see that my father's changed smile was not a failure or a weakness, but the mark of survival, a sign of someone who had endured more than he could ever fully share. Looking back now, I know that his quiet was a form of protection, not only for himself, but for us. And while it cost us closeness, it also taught me empathy, patience, and the ability to sit with discomfort without turning away. This story, the one I am telling now, is not about blaming him or romanticizing his pain, but about acknowledging the truth that war does not always end when soldiers return home, and that the ones who love them often carry pieces of that war too, quietly, faithfully, and for a lifetime. Before the war ever entered our lives, before uniforms and goodbyes and careful silences became part of our daily language, my father was a gentle, openly joyful man, the kind who laughed from his chest and filled rooms with an easy warmth. And those early memories are the ones I hold most carefully now, because they remind me that the change I witnessed did not come from who he was, but from what he endured. Our home in those early years was modest but full of life, with my mother humming as she cooked, my father whistling while he fixed things around the house, and me following him everywhere, convinced that my place in the world was right beside him. He used to lift me onto his shoulders when we walked to the park, pointing out birds, clouds, and passing cars, as if everything deserved to be noticed and appreciated. And I remember feeling completely safe, completely certain that nothing bad could reach us as long as his hands were steady and his voice was near. When the letter came telling him he was being sent away, I was too young to understand what it truly meant, but I remember the way my mother went quiet, the way my father held her just a little longer that night, and the way the house seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. He tried to keep things light for me, telling me he was going on a trip and that I needed to help my mother while he was gone, and I promised him I would, not knowing that promises made in innocence often carry the heaviest weight. The day he left, he knelt down in front of me, looked directly into my eyes, and smiled the same bright smile I had always known, and that image stayed with me through the months and years that followed, becoming a reference point for who he was before everything changed. While he was away, my mother and I settled into a routine built around waiting, checking the mailbox, rereading his letters, and marking time with small rituals that made his absence bearable. And in those letters, he sounded almost like himself, reassuring, affectionate, and careful not to worry us, even though I now understand how much he must have been holding back. My mother never spoke badly about the war, never complained, never let her fear show in front of me, and instead she poured her strength into keeping our home steady, teaching me kindness, patience, and the importance of showing up even when it is hard. By the time my father returned, I had grown taller, learned to read, and begun to understand that time does not stop simply because we want it to. And yet, in my child's mind, I believed that once he came home, everything would return to the way it had been. Instead, what returned was a man who looked like my father, but moved through the world more carefully, as if every step had to be measured, every sound evaluated, every moment approached with caution. And while he never spoke of fear, I could feel it in the way he lived. Our family adjusted quietly, without discussion, because that is what love often looks like when words are too heavy. And I learned to sense his moods, to give him space when he needed it, and to accept affection in smaller, more restrained forms. My mother continued to be the bridge between us, offering warmth where he could not, explaining his silences without excusing them, and reminding me through her actions that love does not always look the way we expect it to. As the years went on, our home became a place of structure and order, comforting in its predictability, but missing the spontaneous joy that once defined it. And I grew up thinking this was simply how families were, unaware of how deeply our experience was shaped by something that happened far away before I was old enough to understand it. Even then, there were moments of connection, quiet and fleeting, when my father would sit beside me, help with homework, or listen as I talked about my day. And in those moments, I felt the closeness I had missed, even if it was brief. Looking back now, I see how much effort it took for him to be present at all, how much strength it required to live an ordinary life while carrying extraordinary memories, and I understand that the foundation of our family was built not on ease, but on endurance, patience, and a kind of love that survived by adapting rather than insisting on being seen. As I moved from childhood into adolescence, the shape of our family life became clearer to me, not through dramatic moments, but through repetition, routine, and the quiet rules we all seemed to follow without ever speaking them out loud. And I began to understand that our home was built around protecting my father from things he could not bear, even if we did not fully understand what those things were. Mornings were calm and orderly, my mother rising early to prepare breakfast, my father sitting at the table with his newspaper, sipping coffee in silence, and me watching them both, sensing that love existed in the room even when words did not, and that this was our version of normal. My father rarely showed anger, never raised his voice, and never struck fear into us. And yet there was a tension that lived just beneath the surface, a carefulness that shaped how we spoke, laughed, and even moved, because we all knew instinctively that sudden noise or emotional outbursts could pull him somewhere he did not want to go. School events, holidays, and family gatherings followed the same pattern, my father attending when he could, standing slightly apart, smiling politely, leaving early if things became too loud or crowded, and my mother always watching him closely, ready to adjust plans without complaint. As a young girl, I admired her strength, the way she carried our family with grace, never demanding more from him than he could give. And I learned from her that love sometimes means accepting what is offered, even when it is less than what you hoped for. At the same time, I felt a quiet longing for more, for stories, laughter, and openness, and that longing often turned inward, shaping me into a thoughtful, observant child who learned to read rooms, moods, and silences with careful attention. My friends saw my father as kind but reserved, and teachers described him as dependable and polite. And while those descriptions were accurate, they did not capture the distance I felt as his daughter, the sense that there was a wall between us, built from experiences I could not access and questions I did not know how to ask. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him moving quietly through the house, unable to sleep, and I would lie awake too, wondering what memories followed him into the dark, what images returned when the world was quiet enough to let them in. My mother and I never discussed these moments openly, but there was an understanding between us, a shared awareness that some pain is carried privately and that speaking it aloud does not always make it easier to bear. As I grew older, I tried in small ways to reach him, asking about his childhood, his favorite music, the things he liked before the war, and he would answer gently but briefly, redirecting the conversation back to me as if my life was safer ground than his own past. I began to see that his silence was not indifference, but self-preservation, a way of staying present without reopening wounds that never fully healed. And that realization softened some of the frustration I carried, even as it deepened my sadness. My teenage years were shaped by this balance of love and distance, and while I never rebelled openly, I often felt emotionally older than my peers, carrying an awareness of pain, responsibility, and restraint that they had not yet encountered. My father encouraged my education, praised my achievements in his quiet way, and showed up when it mattered most, even if he stood in the background, and I learned to recognize those gestures as acts of love, even if they did not come wrapped in warmth or enthusiasm. At the same time, I noticed how the war lingered in him physically, in the stiffness of his movements, the way he scanned rooms automatically, and the exhaustion that sometimes settled over him without warning, and I realized that his body remembered what his words refused to revisit. Our family life continued steadily, uneventfully from the outside, and I often wondered how many other families lived this way, shaped by events no one talked about, carrying histories that were invisible but powerful. By the time I reached adulthood, I understood that my father's changed smile was not something that would ever return to its old shape, and that waiting for him to become who he once was only kept me from appreciating who he was now, a man who had endured, survived, and done his best to love within the limits of what he could carry. This understanding did not erase the sadness or the sense of loss, but it gave me a deeper compassion, not only for him, but for myself, and for all the quiet ways people adapt to pain in order to keep going. Looking back, I see that the foundation of my life was built on these unspoken lessons: patience, empathy, resilience, and the ability to love without demanding explanations. And while I would not have chosen this path, it shaped me into a woman who understands that strength is not always loud, that survival often looks like silence, and that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that unfold quietly over years inside the walls of an ordinary home. The older I became, the more I realized that the quiet structure we had built around my father's pain was beginning to strain under the weight of ordinary life. Because while silence can protect for a time, it can also create distance, misunderstandings, and unspoken needs that slowly ask to be seen. And I felt those tensions growing inside me as I stepped fully into adulthood. I left home for school, carrying with me not only my suitcase, but the habits I had learned so well: measured emotions, careful words, and a belief that love was something you proved through patience rather than expression. And at first, that distance felt like relief, like space to breathe without constantly monitoring the emotional weather around my father. Yet, even away from home, his presence followed me, shaping how I formed friendships, how I avoided conflict, and how I struggled to ask for help, because I had learned early that strong people did not complain, they endured. When I returned home for visits, I noticed changes more clearly than before, small cracks in the routine that had once held us together so neatly: my father aging faster than he should have, his movements slower, his silences heavier, and my mother growing more tired, more inward, carrying years of quiet accommodation on her shoulders. Conversations felt thinner, stretched between what was said and what was avoided, and I often found myself wanting to ask harder questions, to understand him not just as my father, but as a man who had lived through something that reshaped his entire being. Yet every time I opened my mouth, I felt the old hesitation rise up, the fear of pushing him into pain he had worked so hard to keep contained. At the same time, I began to feel an unexpected resentment, not sharp or angry, but dull and persistent, a sense that the war had taken something from me too, something I had never been allowed to grieve because it was wrapped in gratitude for his survival. I watched my friends' parents grow into more relaxed versions of themselves, sharing stories, laughter, and warmth as their children became adults, and I wondered what it would be like to sit with my father and talk openly, to hear him say more than "I'm fine," to feel that he knew me not just as his daughter, but as a person. These thoughts unsettled me because they felt disloyal, and for a long time I pushed them aside, reminding myself that he had done his best, that he had survived, that we owed him understanding, and yet the longing remained, quietly shaping my internal world. The tension deepened when my mother's health began to falter, not dramatically at first, but in subtle ways: fatigue that lingered, small aches that did not fade, a softness in her voice when she tried to reassure us that everything was fine. And I saw how my father struggled with this change, how the fear he rarely acknowledged seemed to rise closer to the surface. He became more withdrawn, more vigilant, hovering near her without knowing how to express his worry, and I felt caught between them, wanting to support both, yet unsure how to bridge the emotional gaps that had existed for so long. There were moments when the weight of everything felt overwhelming, when I wanted to shake him gently and say, "We are here. You don't have to carry this alone." But years of habit held me back, and instead I offered help in practical ways: running errands, managing appointments, and filling the role I had been trained for so well. The more responsibility I took on, the more I noticed how little we talked about feelings, about fear, about the future, and I began to see how this avoidance, once protective, was now limiting our ability to face new challenges together. I also noticed changes in myself, a growing restlessness, a quiet ache that surfaced in moments of stillness, as if a part of me was asking for acknowledgement, for permission to feel disappointed, confused, and even sad about the father-daughter relationship we never fully had. These feelings did not come with blame, but they carried a deep exhaustion, the tiredness of loving someone deeply while constantly adjusting your expectations to avoid pain. Family gatherings became more complicated, not because of arguments, but because of what hovered beneath the surface. My father sitting quietly while conversations flowed around him, my mother trying to keep things light, and me watching it all with a new awareness that time was moving forward, whether we were ready or not. I began to worry about what would happen if things remained unsaid, if understanding never deepened, if the distance between us stayed fixed, and that worry stirred something inside me, a sense that waiting quietly might no longer be enough. At the same time, I felt compassion for my father stronger than ever, seeing how much effort it took for him to function each day, how carefully he managed his inner world to protect himself and those he loved. And this compassion made my internal conflict even more complex, because how do you ask more from someone who has already given so much of themselves? The rising tension in our family was not loud or dramatic, but it was persistent, like a low hum that never fully fades, and I felt it in the pauses between words, in the things we did not say, and in the growing awareness that love, while present, was being stretched by time, change, and the unspoken legacy of a war that ended decades ago, but was still shaping our lives in ways we were only beginning to confront. As time moved forward, the quiet tension that had settled into our family life began to show itself more clearly, not through arguments or raised voices, but through moments of emotional misalignment, when what one of us needed did not match what the others were able to give. And those moments accumulated slowly, like small stones added one by one to a pocket already heavy with years of restraint. My mother's health continued to weaken in ways that demanded attention, and while my father did everything he could in practical terms, driving her to appointments, preparing meals, and watching over her with a constant, almost rigid vigilance, he struggled to meet her emotional needs, and I could see the loneliness in her eyes when she spoke to me quietly in the kitchen, saying things like, "He worries so much, but he doesn't talk," as if she were trying to convince herself as much as she was explaining it to me. I found myself stepping into the role of emotional translator, listening to her fears, offering reassurance, and then trying, gently and carefully, to support my father without overwhelming him. And this balancing act left me exhausted in ways I had never fully acknowledged before. There were days when I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all, at the way the war had shaped not only his life but ours, and yet that frustration always dissolved into guilt because I knew he had not chosen this burden, and that knowledge kept my feelings trapped inside, unnamed and unresolved. I began to notice how my father's silences had grown heavier, not just with memory, but with age, as if the energy required to keep everything contained was slowly wearing him down, and I worried about what would happen if that control slipped, if the walls he had built finally gave way. Attempts at deeper conversation were awkward and brief, moments when I would ask how he was feeling or if he needed help, and he would respond with a soft, "I'm all right," followed by a change of subject, and each time I felt the familiar mixture of relief and disappointment settle in my chest. My own life, with its responsibilities, relationships, and growing awareness of time's passage, began to feel increasingly intertwined with theirs, and I struggled to maintain boundaries, unsure where my role as a daughter ended and my role as a caretaker began. Friends encouraged me to speak openly, to insist on conversations, to name the pain we were all carrying, but they did not understand the unspoken rules of our family, the way silence had become both shield and language, and I found it difficult to imagine breaking that pattern without causing harm. The tension reached a quiet peak during a family gathering meant to celebrate a milestone, a simple event that should have been filled with joy, but instead felt strained as my father grew visibly uncomfortable with the noise and attention. My mother tried to smooth things over, and I stood in the middle, aware of how fragile our balance had become. That evening, after everyone left, I found my father sitting alone, staring at the floor, and something in his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, made me feel a sudden urgency, a fear that time was slipping away faster than we realized. I sat beside him, wanting to say something meaningful, something that could bridge the years of careful distance between us, but the words felt too big, too heavy, and all I managed was to place my hand gently over his, an action that felt both inadequate and deeply significant. He did not pull away, but he did not respond either, and in that quiet moment I felt the full weight of our shared history, the love that had survived in small gestures, and the pain that had never found a voice. Later that night, I lay awake, thinking about how many moments like this we might have left, how many chances there were to understand each other more fully, and I felt a growing sense that something had to change, even if I did not yet know how or when. The rising conflict in our lives was not about anger or blame, but about time, about the narrowing space between what had been endured and what still needed to be acknowledged, and I began to sense that the path ahead would require courage of a different kind, not the courage to survive in silence, but the courage to gently, honestly face what had been carried for far too long. The moment that shifted everything did not arrive with drama or raised voices, but with a quiet interruption to the routines we had relied on for so long, the kind of interruption that feels small at first and only later reveals how deeply it has altered the course of things. And for our family, that moment came on an ordinary afternoon when my father did something he had never done before. My mother had been resting in the bedroom after a tiring morning, and I was in the kitchen preparing tea, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, when my father walked in and sat down at the table without saying a word, his movements slower than usual, his hands resting flat in front of him, as if he needed the surface to steady himself. At first, I assumed he was simply tired, another quiet day unfolding as it always had, but then he spoke my name. Softly, carefully, and the sound of it made me look up immediately because there was something different in his voice, something uncertain and exposed that I had never heard before. He did not look at me right away, and when he finally did, his eyes were filled with a kind of vulnerability that caught me off guard, because it was not fear or sadness exactly, but something closer to surrender, as if he had reached the end of his ability to carry everything alone. He told me he had not been sleeping well, that the nights had grown heavier, and that memories he had kept buried for decades were returning more often now, uninvited and persistent. And as he spoke, slowly and without detail, I felt a tightening in my chest, because I realized this was the opening I had waited for my entire life, and yet I was terrified of stepping into it. He did not describe the war, did not name specific events, but he spoke about the feeling of never fully coming back, of leaving part of himself behind and spending the rest of his life trying to function without it. And hearing him say this out loud, even in such a restrained way, felt like standing at the edge of something vast and fragile. I wanted to tell him how much I loved him, how proud I was, how much his presence had meant to me even in its quietness, but the words caught in my throat because I sensed that this moment was not about reassurance, it was about listening, about allowing him the space he had never taken for himself. He spoke about guilt, too, about surviving when others did not, about feeling undeserving of happiness, and about the fear that if he allowed himself to feel too much, everything he had worked to contain would overwhelm him. And as he spoke, I saw not the reserved father I had known, but a young man who had been asked to endure more than he was prepared for, and who had spent a lifetime paying the price in silence. Tears welled in my eyes, not because of what he said, but because of how long it had taken for him to say anything at all. And I realized in that moment that the distance between us had not been created by lack of love, but by an excess of protection, each of us trying to shield the other from pain we did not know how to share. When he finally paused, the room felt impossibly still, and I was aware of my own breathing, slow and deliberate, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile honesty that had settled between us. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his, just as I had done days earlier, but this time he turned his palm upward, allowing his hand to rest fully in mine, and that simple gesture carried more meaning than any speech could have, because it was the first time he had allowed himself to be held emotionally as well as physically. In that moment, I understood that the turning point in our story was not about uncovering the past in detail, but about acknowledging its presence, about allowing pain to be named without being relived, and about recognizing that healing does not always require full disclosure, only honesty, patience, and the courage to let someone else see the parts of you that have been hidden for far too long. After that afternoon, something subtle but undeniable shifted in the air between my father and me. Not in a way that suddenly made everything easy or healed, but in a way that changed how we moved around one another, as if an unspoken permission had been granted to acknowledge what had always been there. And in the days that followed, I noticed him watching me more closely, not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness, as though he was finally allowing himself to be seen as a man who had been wounded, not just as a father who was expected to endure. He did not suddenly become talkative, and he did not begin sharing stories of the war in any clear or detailed way, but there was a softness in him that I had never experienced before, a slight loosening of the tight control he had maintained for so long, and I realized that this too was effort, perhaps more effort than any visible action could show. One evening, as the sun was setting and the house was filled with that gentle golden light that always made everything feel calmer, he surprised me by asking if I would sit with him on the porch, something he rarely did unless my mother insisted. And as we sat side by side, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into night, he spoke again, slowly, carefully, as if choosing each word with intention. He told me that when he came home from the war, he believed the best thing he could do for his family was to stay strong, to provide, to never let his pain become a burden. And he admitted that he had not known another way to live because vulnerability had felt dangerous, like something that could unravel him completely. Hearing him say this did not bring anger or blame into my heart, only understanding, because I could see how deeply he had believed he was protecting us, even as that protection had created a distance he did not know how to bridge. He spoke about moments he had missed, about times when he wanted to laugh or cry openly but felt unable to do so. And he said something that stayed with me long after that night, that he had feared if he allowed himself happiness, it would somehow betray those who had never returned home. And as he said it, his voice wavered just slightly, enough to reveal how heavy that belief had been. I wanted to tell him that he deserved joy, that survival was not something to apologize for, but instead I listened because I sensed that what he needed most was not correction, but companionship in the truth he was finally allowing himself to voice. In the quiet that followed, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, and I wondered if this was what rest looked like for him now, not the absence of memory, but the presence of understanding. And I felt a deep ache in my chest for all the years he had carried this alone. Over the next few weeks, there were small changes that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but to me they felt monumental, like the way he lingered a little longer at the dinner table, or how he asked about my day with genuine curiosity instead of polite routine, or how he began sitting closer to my mother on the couch, sometimes reaching for her hand in a way that felt tentative but sincere. These moments did not erase the past, but they softened it, and I realized that healing was unfolding not as a dramatic transformation, but as a series of quiet permissions, each one allowing a bit more connection than before. There was one night, however, that marked the deepest point of this turning, when my father experienced a dream that left him shaken, and instead of retreating into silence as he might have in the past, he came to my room and knocked gently on the door, a sound that startled me because he had never done that before. When I opened it, I saw his face pale and tired, his eyes filled with something that looked like fear, and without explaining much, he asked if he could sit with me for a moment, and as he spoke about the dream in vague terms, I understood that it had brought old memories to the surface, memories he still could not name, but could no longer ignore. I sat with him until his breathing slowed, until the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, and in that moment our roles shifted in a way that felt natural and right, not because he was weak, but because he was finally allowing himself to be human. As he left my room that night, he paused at the door and said, "Thank you," a simple phrase that carried decades of unspoken need, and I knew then that the true turning point in our story was not about fixing what had been broken, but about redefining strength, about learning that resilience could include asking for help, and that love could grow deeper when it was allowed to meet pain without fear. In the weeks that followed that night, life did not suddenly become lighter or easier, but it became more honest, and that honesty settled into our home in quiet, steady ways, like dust slowly falling after a storm. And I began to notice how my father carried himself differently, not healed, not whole, but less guarded, as though the walls he had built were no longer being reinforced every single day. He still woke early, still kept his routines, still moved through the world with the discipline that had shaped him for so long, but there was now a softness around the edges, a willingness to pause, to listen, to stay present a little longer than before. Sometimes he would sit at the kitchen table long after his coffee had gone cold, staring out the window, and instead of assuming he was lost in memories I could never reach, I would sit across from him quietly, sharing the space without trying to fill it, and he never asked me to leave. My mother noticed it too, though she spoke of it gently, as if afraid that naming the change might scare it away. And one evening she told me that he had begun sleeping more peacefully, that the sharp movements and sudden waking had eased just a little, and hearing that made something in my chest loosen, because it meant the war was no longer the only thing living with us at night. There were moments when the old distance returned, when he grew quiet again or retreated into himself, but now I understood that this was not rejection, but fatigue, the natural ebb and flow of someone learning how to carry pain differently, and that understanding allowed me to meet him with patience instead of hurt. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the garage, he found a small stack of photographs from before the war, Images of himself as a young man with an easy smile, his arms slung around friends whose names I did not know, and he brought them into the house, setting them carefully on the table as if they were fragile. And for the first time he told me who some of those men were, not how they died or what they saw, but who they were before everything changed. He spoke of laughter, of shared meals, of ordinary hopes, and as he talked, I saw how much he had lost, not only in people, but in parts of himself that had never been allowed to return. And I realized that grief does not always come from a single moment, but from a lifetime of goodbyes that are never fully acknowledged. Listening to him then felt like an act of trust, and I held his words carefully, knowing how long they had been kept inside. And when he stopped speaking, I did not rush to respond, because I knew that silence, too, was part of what he was learning to share. Slowly, our conversations grew more frequent, still gentle, still measured, but more open, and sometimes he would ask me questions about my life, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity, and I found myself answering honestly, not editing my feelings to protect him, because I sensed that he wanted to know me now, not just as his daughter, but as a person who could stand beside him in truth. There was a day when he apologized, not with grand words or dramatic emotion, but simply for being distant, and though the apology did not undo the years of silence, it acknowledged them, and that acknowledgment mattered more than I had ever expected. I told him that I understood, that I never doubted his love, even when I could not feel it, and as I said it, I realized that forgiveness had been growing quietly inside me long before this moment, waiting only for the chance to be spoken aloud. Our family did not become loud or openly expressive overnight, but laughter returned in small, surprising ways, like during a shared meal or a simple joke, and when it did, my father would sometimes pause, as if startled by the sound of himself enjoying the moment, and then allow it to continue. And each time he did, it felt like a quiet victory over the past. I began to see how deeply the war had shaped not just him, but all of us, how its echoes had influenced the way we communicated, the way we loved, the way we avoided discomfort, and recognizing that helped me release the idea that anyone had failed, because survival demanded sacrifices none of us had fully understood. There were still nights when memories returned for him, when his sleep was restless or his eyes distant, but now he was not entirely alone in those moments, and sometimes he would sit in the living room until morning, and I would join him, and we would share the quiet, not fixing, not forcing, just being there, and that presence became our shared language. Through all of this, I learned that resolution does not mean forgetting or erasing pain, but learning how to live alongside it without letting it define every relationship. And watching my father slowly reclaim pieces of himself taught me that healing is not a destination, but a process that unfolds in patience, humility, and connection. As weeks turned into months, I felt a sense of peace I had never known before. Not because everything was resolved, but because the truth was finally allowed to breathe. And in that space, love found new ways to grow. Quieter, perhaps, but deeper and more enduring than anything we had known before. Over the following months, our family continued to adapt to this new rhythm, one shaped by understanding, patience, and a willingness to meet one another halfway. And I realized that the resilience my father had demonstrated for decades could now be joined with the resilience my mother and I had cultivated, forming a web of quiet strength that held us together in ways we had never imagined. I noticed my father smiling more often, small, fleeting smiles that began at the corners of his mouth and then lingered longer as he shared memories, asked questions about my life, or even helped me with chores around the house. And these moments, though ordinary to anyone else, felt monumental to me because they represented the slow return of someone I thought I had only glimpsed in fragments over the years. Our conversations became deeper, still careful, still measured, but infused with honesty and vulnerability, and I could feel trust expanding in the space between us, a trust that allowed for the expression of emotion without fear of judgment or collapse. My mother, who had borne so much silently, began to smile more too, and we would sometimes sit together in the evening, quietly sharing tea or a snack, speaking in simple words about ordinary events, yet in that simplicity lay a profound sense of connection that had been absent for decades. We began to make new traditions, small gestures that marked our togetherness, weekend walks, shared meals without distraction, quiet evenings of reading in the same room. And in these moments, the war that at once loomed over us became a background presence, acknowledged but no longer dictating how we related to one another. I also saw changes in myself, a softening of the tension I had carried, a release of guilt and frustration that had accumulated over years of careful observation, and a recognition that my father's survival had shaped me in ways that gave me both empathy and strength. And now I could honor that by showing patience and love without sacrificing my own emotional needs. There were still days of quiet unease, days when memories returned unexpectedly for him or when fatigue made the weight of life feel heavier, but these days no longer carried the isolation they once had because we faced them together, not in silence, but with a shared understanding that each of us had been shaped by the past and that love could still grow despite it. One afternoon, as we were organizing old photographs and keepsakes, my father picked up a picture of himself and a group of men from the war, his expression soft, and he told me the stories behind each face, not the horrors, but the friendships, the jokes, the camaraderie, and I felt a sense of closure begin to settle over us, a reconciliation with the parts of life and history that had been too heavy to speak of before. I realized then that resolution was not about erasing the past or pretending the pain did not exist, but about allowing space for healing, for honesty, and for love to manifest in ways that were authentic and sustainable. I began to document our days in small ways, writing letters to my father, recording moments, and sharing memories, not to preserve perfection, but to acknowledge the journey we had traveled together. And in doing so, I felt an expanding sense of gratitude for the resilience, courage, and tenderness that had carried us through. Slowly, the house felt lighter, not because the memories had vanished, but because they had been met with empathy and presence rather than avoidance, and that shift transformed how we interacted with each other, bringing laughter, gentle teasing, and small celebrations of everyday life back into our home. Our relationships grew richer, deeper, and more nuanced, and I recognized that this slow, careful healing was itself a triumph, a demonstration of the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to love in spite of everything. In observing my father reclaim parts of himself, in seeing my mother's quiet happiness return, and in feeling my own heart soften, I understood that resolution is never instantaneous, never dramatic, but it can be profound, subtle, and enduring, and that the legacy of love, patience, and understanding we built together would continue to shape our lives for years to come. And in those moments, I finally felt the sense of completion that had eluded us for decades. Not because the past was gone, but because we had found a way to live with it, to honor it, and to create a family life that could hold the full spectrum of human experience, from suffering to joy, from silence to connection, and from endurance to profound love. As the years moved forward, I came to understand that life's most important lessons often arrive quietly, without warning, and rarely in the way we imagine. And our family story became a testament to patience, resilience, and the subtle power of love that persists even in the shadow of hardship. I watched my father grow older, slower, but with a serenity that had been absent for decades, and I realized that the smiles we shared now were richer because they had survived years of struggle, years of restraint, and the unspoken weight of a history that shaped every gesture and every word. My mother, too, found renewed joy in ordinary moments, baking, tending the garden, laughing softly over shared memories, and I understood that happiness is not a final state, but a choice to notice, appreciate, and nurture the small instances that weave the fabric of daily life. I reflected on the times I had felt frustrated, disconnected, or yearning for more, and I saw now that those emotions were part of a necessary journey, one that had taught me empathy, emotional patience, and the value of staying present even when circumstances were imperfect. Our family gatherings, once tense and cautious, began to carry warmth again, filled with gentle laughter, quiet conversations, and a sense of togetherness that had been missing for so long, and I cherished each moment as a victory of endurance and love. I also noticed the effect this healing had on my own life and how I approached friendships, romantic relationships, and my own family, understanding that people carry invisible burdens, that patience and presence matter more than perfection, and that quiet, consistent acts of love often have the greatest impact. One evening, as I sat with my father watching the sun set behind the trees, he took my hand and said simply, "Thank you for staying." And in that phrase was the acknowledgement of years of silent endurance, unspoken understanding, and shared struggle. And I felt a swell of gratitude for the chance to witness him fully, to love him without expectation, and to be loved in return. I realized that endings are not about the story finishing neatly, but about recognizing growth, connection, and the power of shared resilience. And in that understanding, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had little to do with the past and everything to do with the present we were now building. Life, I learned, is never perfect, and neither are families, yet the capacity to hold pain, to forgive, to support one another, and to love deeply creates a foundation that can withstand even the heaviest storms. And in seeing my father reclaim pieces of himself, I discovered that the heart's strength is measured not by what it avoids, but by what it endures and embraces. As I looked back on decades of struggle, waiting, and quiet longing, I understood that our story was never about the absence of hardship, but about the courage to remain connected, to listen, and to allow love to take its natural course, unhurried, patient, and enduring. In these reflections, I found not only a sense of closure, but also hope that even in the aftermath of trauma, even in families shaped by silence, it is possible to rebuild, to reconnect, and to find a peace that is both gentle and profound. And that lesson became a guiding light for me in every aspect of my life moving forward. In the quiet of those later years, I often thought about how much our family had changed, not because the past had vanished, but because we had learned to carry it differently, with acceptance, understanding, and love that was steady rather than dramatic. And in that shift, I found a profound sense of peace I had longed for as a child. I saw my father engage with life in ways I had never expected, helping with chores without complaint, asking questions about my life with genuine curiosity, laughing softly at small jokes, and showing affection in the gentle ways he had learned were safe. And in each of these moments, I felt the quiet miracle of healing that comes not in bursts, but in patient, sustained connection. My mother's laughter became a familiar sound again, filling the spaces between us without pressure or expectation, and I watched both of them grow into a rhythm that honored their past while allowing them to participate fully in the present, a balance that had once seemed impossible. I reflected on my own journey through the years, the longing, the frustration, the moments of quiet observation, and recognized how much those experiences shaped me into a woman capable of empathy, patience, and deep emotional connection, qualities I now carried into every relationship in my life. I understood that our family story was not about perfect resolution, nor was it about erasing the pain of the past, but about the courage to face it together, to allow vulnerability without fear, and to find strength not in stoicism alone, but in shared presence, listening, and gentle support. As I sat with them, often in the soft light of the evening, I realized that this was the true gift, the ability to see and be seen, to give and receive care freely, and to embrace the imperfect human journey we had all traveled. The lessons of endurance, patience, and love became part of my own legacy, something I could carry forward into the world beyond our home, remembering always that even the quietest acts of connection matter profoundly. And as the sun set on countless ordinary evenings, I felt a deep gratitude for the life we had built together, for the healing that had unfolded slowly but surely, and for the knowledge that even in the shadow of unspoken pain, it is possible to create a family life full of warmth, understanding, and hope, leaving me with a gentle reassurance that love, patience, and the courage to be present are the most enduring gifts we can give one another, shaping not just our past and present, but the generations that follow.